Today, I call myself the last Mohican of the original SOD school. And also, I call myself the last survivor of the SOD school. That's my entrance to reflexivity. And I put these 3 phases of evolution of SOD, and I will go into it in more detail in a second. But when I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, I put some axioms that for me was maybe the takeaway of, if I don't say anything, then I would say this. Design should be a liberating experience. Not everybody wants to be liberated. I mean, most of us have seen the Matrix. Some of us rather take the blue pill and stay in the prisons of their own mind. So liberation doesn't necessarily mean happier people. It means usually frustrated people who are looking for outlets for their frustration. Now, the second thing is that design theory, and we mentioned Maturana and Varela, design inquiry is a theory about how to develop theories. It is a theory in itself, but it doesn't produce anything about the world. The world is innocent, and we come up with our explanations of it. But again, if we're saying that it's a liberating experience, we can change the theory of inquiry every time that we go into the room. This is why design doctrine is an oxymoron. You cannot put design in a doctrine. That means that you've chose one manual and you'll continue to do things the same way even though reality is changing. The third thing is that design inquiry is thus measured in the degrees of freedom that it creates. And this is what we do when we do design inquiries with generals. We try to get them to, again, to liberate themselves and to get way beyond what they know, their paradigm, their beliefs, their value system, their experience, and we do it in all kinds of tricks that I'll explain more in detail later. We do design inquiries, and we see these people in the military that we bring them for the first time, not to the course, maybe in other occasions, when they're told to do an inquiry, and they don't even ask themselves the first question, which is, why go about doing a design inquiry? Why is situation assessment not enough? Why do we need to start this whole specific process that might not end where we want it to end? Okay, so Albert Einstein said 99% of the truth is to get the right question, and then 1% of it will come up with a solution. So really, design inquiry, when you start it, is to ask yourself, why do I need it? Don't I have enough already to go to problem solving? And many people tend to just overcome that and go straight to the inquiry. And then they don't realize why they don't come up with anything at the end. It's because they didn't have this crisis, original crisis, that will get them, drive them to an inquiry. So is this considered an inquiry? Is this considered a design event? And we will say, no, it's not. If you started, again, if you decided that you need a design inquiry, and you went through this process, and you thought that you were thinking critically and bringing all these people and doing all these perspectives and really sweating over it, but at the end you realize that your strategy is good and you can continue with your own current operations, it means that you didn't reach a design moment. The greatest epiphanies that you reach, the hangover comes right after. Okay? It's always like this. Or you're in design team and you've worked on something for 3 days, and then the commander comes and you show him your product, and then he doesn't get it, or he says that it's crap. Always, the hangover always comes, guaranteed. It always also comes during an inquiry, when you will sit with the same people. I tend to say that you never go into, like the river always flows, and you don't cross the same river twice. You don't go into the same design room twice. Again, there are no guarantees, and sometimes the same room of people, the same event, talking about the same topic, will sit for 3 hours. It will be a great session. They will leave, they will come back, and they will sit for the next session, and it will yield nothing. Depression, epiphany, depression, were manic depressive people doing design. Just to show you, for those of you who haven't, ever known all the phases of SOD, this is what it started like in 95. This is what it looks like, I mean, graphically. I'm not going into whole details about what exactly we were doing, but some of the words, I mean, Alice, we talked about it last night. I mean, has it really changed? Is it 3 revolutions, or is it an evolution of the original idea? It's definitely an evolution of the original idea, but we put the emphasis in different places. And as I wrote, when we were doing SOD in the 90s, late 90s, we weren't concerned with strategy. Israel wasn't concerned with strategy. The Israeli military wasn't concerned with strategy. We really considered the 3 spheres of function, the strategic, operational, and tactics, as 3 distinct spheres of function. And strategy was something, strategy as an artifact was something that was supposed to be given to us by the politicians, or maybe the chief of general staff. But it wasn't an integral part of the design. What was in the design in system framing was a directive. And since in that early stage, we didn't talk about real life, we were doing scenarios, we would write the directive, which was also always such a beautiful, piece. And then we would write this beautiful scenario, and, everything would be very logical, and it didn't do any kind of work with the people. When you get to the senior generals, they know bullshit when they see it. So there wasn't strategy there. There was a big deal about framing, which we brought from design. If I need to choose one thing to say about framing, is this, that framing a session or framing a part of the design inquiry is a condition to moving on to the next session, which people tend to overlook. When it's starting to be doctrine, when it's starting to be something that you just automatically do, you will say, well, there are a couple of phases to the inquiry. I have 3 days. Okay, I'm going to do 3 hours on system framing, whatever it means. I'm going to do 3 hours on rival as rationale, and then command as rationale and logistics. I'll just go through them. Even if I didn't reach a breakthrough in the phase before. So if I had to choose one thing to say about framing, is condition. The second big thing I think that was a part of the first version of SOD was what is called to rival as rationale. And that was a big deal, again, because most of the people who started SOD were ex-military soldiers, generals, brigadier generals. And they were used to thinking of the rival as the enemy that you actually see or hear or get intelligence on. It was something very, present in the ontology of life. And the big breakthrough in calling the rival as rationale is saying that it's something that you just use to reflect on yourself, because you will never know what your enemy thinks. You will never know what his strategy is. It doesn't matter how many documents you're going to read, it is subjective, and you only use it to construct your own logic and form. And you test it again through operations, but this is your own creation. It has nothing to do with real world, real life. So that was the second thing that we should say about this phase. The third thing that we should say about this phase, which I like when we're looking at the graphics, is that system framing has to do with structuring, and we kept structuring through all the evolutions. Again, structuring is how I think about what I think, how I think about the theory, and not the content itself. But if you look at how much time we're putting on the framing, system framing, when there's no strategy here, and we're doing all kinds of things in the middle, we stopped talking, by the way, about command of logistics, but basically, from here down on end, we are oriented in operations. I mean, very little about structuring and strategy, and most of it is about operations. The second evolution of SOD, that's what he was using in CENTCOM and SOCOM at the days, but with a lot more around it. Okay, here you can see again, we still have something new here. Still operations, still system framing, but we start talking about strategy. That was the big thing that happened when we started working with the Empire, as I wrote in my think piece. And he put a lot of time into thinking about this new cosmological approach and how you come about thinking of strategy through design and systems lens, and using all kinds of sources that you haven't paid attention to before. And this whole this could take, if we were talking about 3 days of inquiry, this alone can take about a day and a half of the 3 days. If you don't reach an understanding about, again, the drift is something that is taken from this ecological viewpoint and from Heraclitus, where we say that since the river always, everything changes and everything flows and the variety is accelerating, even if at some point your level of understanding of the world and what actually happened in the world, your interpretation of it, were parallel and made sense, at some point you will get in a phase where it's not relevant anymore. In a nutshell, what we call the drift. The drift is the key to moving on. I mean, if you don't get that, if that's not the crisis that you reach at the beginning, you wouldn't be able to come with an alternative because you wouldn't understand what the problem is right now or what the question is that you need to ask. So that's one thing, the drift. The second thing that has to do with strategy, which he came with, was T4, or transformation in 4 dimensions. To transform the way I think, to transform my understanding of the world, to transform my organization, and only then I can think about intervention or transforming the world itself. Now, what's interesting about it is that, again, even if I'm putting it into rough percentage, 75% of the transformation is blue. And only the end of it is red, where we tend to think about intervention is going straight to T4. Okay, so that was a really big deal, again, in this second evolution of SOD. Now, the third thing is what we call the opposition system. And that, again, has to do with why we don't call it rivalist rationale, although it's supposed to do the same thing, because what we wanted to put the emphasis on in that phase was that whatever strategy we come up with, whatever system we came up with here in the context of our inquiry, we will have a certain strategy that will bring certain opposition, which is not necessarily what we tend to think of as opposition in our cases. For example, in the Israeli case, and that's been going on for 3 years now, the situation since the beginning of the civil war in Syria, if we can call it civil war, like the Third World War in Syria, is that Hezbollah and us have shared interests. Now, to this day, the military is doing its force build-up against Hezbollah. But the reality in the last 4 years is that we want Hezbollah to keep ISIS away from us, or the Islamic State away from us. So is Hezbollah the traditional rival enemy in the northern arena still our opposition? Big deal. So this is why that became a key change in the inquiry, to figure out what is the opposition system for this snapshot of time that we decided to cut from the longue durée of reality. And that may change in a year, that may change in a few months. But when we think of an operation, a strategy which is concentrated and constrained in time, an opposition to that strategy, which is constrained in time, it can change. And then the operation may not include Hezbollah, let's say, in the northern arena in 2016. One more thing that was really important, and it's also something that's less convenient to talk about for soldiers, is that, again, if we said 75% of transformation is the blue, it means that 75% of the opposition is in the blue. Now, this is inconvenient for soldiers to talk about the problems within your own institution, organization, paradigm, forms of thinking, politicians, society. What do you do with, how do you talk about it? How do you frame an operation that part of the opposition is on your side? The biggest thing, if I have to do it in a nutshell, is bringing things from the implicit to the explicit. Usually when we talk about drift, it's something that either we're not aware of, we can sense. Usually, by the way, the politicians have better sense than us in the military. They sense that things are not working, they just don't know how to explain them. That's why they have to come with a system of inquiry that will make this from an implicit problem to an explicit one that you can actually tackle and break down. So again, the drift is something which is uncomfortable for people. but I think we see it as a crucial thing. This is really all the gray zones. I mean, this is everything that is inconvenient to talk about, that you think that you are not allowed to talk about, that you need other people to talk about because you don't have that knowledge. Every inquiry, you will have to figure out how to envelop that thing that we call here the drift, or how to try to measure how irrelevant you are at a certain point of time. And that, by the way, was Shimon's method of doing it. To say that, again, as Tolstoy said, War and Peace, you're always, as a general, you're always in between. You're always in between events. You're never in just one event in time. So you have to get ready to think about at least 3 time spaces. Okay, one is your legacy, and I tend to call legacy the last place that we felt comfortable with our paradigm and the world. I mean, again, if I have to put it in a sentence, I mean, go back and find it. I mean, it could be a year before, it could be 10 years before, it could be 20 years before. Sometimes we are looking at the chronology of events, but we're also looking at the genealogy of events. I mean, the sources of logic of what happens, and not just the events themselves. So we do that, and then we go to the alternative. I'll come back to the current. We go to the desired state. The desired state, again, is another frame that we do of an alternative future where we can say what our interests are, our desired interests are. We can say we want to get there, although we don't exactly know how to do it. And the desired state will benefit us, again, our strategic interests, better than our current state. So we put another frame, okay? This is a frame, because this has happened, this is easy. We can put it easily. This hasn't happened, so we can feel free to be futurist, okay? This is the hardest one, where the drift is. This is the hardest one to contemplate. So we're trying to do it by comparing frames. If we do these 3 frames, that's what we offer, again, as a kind of a methodology to find the drift, we will understand this better. I mean, when it worked, what we want to work, and this space in the middle. If we go from what we knew and when it worked to what's not working out, we can identify some drawbacks. If we go to the desired state, we can try to pinpoint some potential. And drawback and potential are the mirror image of themselves. And if you're asking me where the strategy is, the transformation would be from here to here.
Ofra, could I ask you a question about, earlier you said crisis.
Yeah.
In my mind, has there been any thought towards if you don't have a crisis, or what it takes to get to a crisis? Because I would imagine that an organization that thinks that everything's okay, then you can't do a lot of this stuff because
Right.
there's no crisis.
Right.
Is that true?
Well, in Israel, we have plenty of crises, so we're never running out of them. What we find in our general's course now, in the last 3 years, that is really working, is to bring interagents. Because what the military doesn't necessarily think is a problem, you get they will show you all your shortcomings. You get politicians in the room. Again, they wouldn't be a part of an inquiry somehow, but you get them to do like a 1-hour presentation about what they think the problem is, or what they think reality is, or where they want to go, you'll get to a crisis. Even just bringing people from the Air Force, from the Navy, from the Army, intelligence, technology, logistics, cyber, people in the same room, one of them will probably have this angle that will, trigger you towards all kinds of rethinking or reflection on the paradigm of what you conventionally think. This is the new version that none of you saw. We call it the Z pattern. Again, we were talking about understanding. Remember that the system framing, the understanding of reality is still here. It's a big part of it. Okay, the opposition system is still a part of it because, again, I said that's a condition to go from your strategy, which you're in love with because you built it and you think it's all harmonious and working, to the first time that you will think self-critically about yourself. And you are doing it. We are our own red team. We are our own red team throughout the process. We are our own red team when we go from each frame to the other. But this is if you haven't done red team until then, that's your red team. Which will bring you finally to making a decision about what your strategy is, and then making a decision about what the operation is. Now, and again, if I go and show you the three of them now, this is starting to look more like Shimon's maps. Okay, and you can try to just compare them. What I put a question mark there because I think that when we were doing originally SOD, we weren't really concerned with what constitutes an inquiry. We thought that that's what generals need to do, and they need to practice how to do it. We weren't concerned with the first big question. Here we were concerned again with the drift and strategy, and here we realized that that's the specific way of life for generals. So they're always in between in complex emergencies, and they will always do that. What's important in this space where we are now is that we came to an understanding, and it's still not going very smoothly with our generals, because they will at the end of an inquiry, no matter how successful it is, someone will ask, what if? What if we got it wrong? Maybe we need to do scenarios. Maybe we need to do another inquiry. What if? And here our answer is absolute. If you've done the design inquiry, if you've done it, again, not correctly, but if you were implying critical thinking and the spiral of heuristics and everything, all this theory that we have behind the inquiry, whatever strategy that you come up with is just, there cannot be another strategy. There can only be one strategy. And for this one strategy that you come up with in the inquiry, there can only be one operation. Only one. And they have to be compatible, which means that you cannot say that you came up with a good strategy, but the operational concept is somewhat lacking. It means that you missed something. Okay, you were uncritical about something. In our case, at least in Israel, we had some good operations where we couldn't say what the strategy was, but it can go the other way. You cannot have, and we had generals, Israeli generals, saying even to this day that they've done this marvelous inquiry, and they came up with a brilliant strategy, but they don't know what to do with it when it comes to operations. It means that they missed something in the way. This is really hard to contemplate. That's, I think, the hardest place that we're at right now is the what ifs. And maybe we do still need some courses of actions or courses of operations. Well, we say, if you did that and you read my think piece, it means that you missed some of the tensions, or you decided to inhibit some of the tensions that you recognized in your system of understanding, or you left them outside. So you left all kinds of dilemmas here that you didn't make a design decision about, and then you came up here and you have options. No options. Why? Because that theory about reality that you've decided that that's yours as a commander, the last critical thing that you're going to do to self-reflect on your thinking is to intervene. Now, if you're not clear about what you do here, if you don't have one strategy or one logic, how would you know where it's going? It's like the end of the Balkan War, when they asked, why did Milosevic capitulate? No one could explain why it happened. This is what happens to us now with the Second Lebanon War and with the last conflict in Gaza in 2014. People start saying, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as you thought. I mean, this is proving to be somewhat successful. But from our point of view, if you can't explain why it happened, the way it happened, then you've done something totally uncritical, and maybe you got lucky. Last thing that I would mention here, because again in Israel, it's a big thing in the last couple of years where we have to work under some kind of threshold of legitimacy. And we have many problems, obviously, in operating our forces. So for a regular army in a national state to think about deep operations, special operations, what we now call operations between war, which again for the Israeli army is meant specifically covert operations, that's another way for us to reflect on ourselves outside of ourselves. Last thing I want to leave you with, about the general's course, another thing that we realize that if it's not interesting for us, and us, I mean, the team of the general course is Shimon, myself, and our commander. That's the team. We used to be the Operational Theory Research Institute with 12 people, 6 ex-brigadier generals, a big building. Now we don't have a building. It's just the two of us and the commander, who has 3 other posts. He's also the Northern Corps commander and the commander of the National Defense College and the commander of all the other colleges, the academy and the general staff, everything. And he's also the commander of the general course. So we've done it 3 times already. We're going to start the 4th course in January, and we keep changing it. I mean, it's not a single event or inquiry is repeating itself, because if we enter the room as cognitive facilitators, and we have an idea of how it's going to unroll, we're going to affect the inquiry. So first of all, we change it for ourselves. If it's not interesting for us, it's not going to be interesting for them. Since we're doing it on the job, the question comes up every time, and again, all their duties are very demanding. And the question is, what is reality? What is real reality? Because sometimes they have a good experience in the inquiry, and they say, well, when we go back to reality, it's not working like this. And we keep challenging them and telling them, this is your reality. What you do here in the general's course should be your reality. When you go out, you're probably messing with stuff that other people should have done if you delegated it to them. Or maybe you're being, drawn to places where you don't have any benefit or advantage over the other people who are doing it. This is what you're supposed to do as generals. You're supposed to develop theories. So maybe the course is your real life, and then when you get back there, you're doing some other things that are not real life. But that's a real tension, and again, we said system of tensions is our life. The last thing about the general course, which keeps coming up, is what kind of impact does the general course have on their own thinking, on the military, on operational design, on operational concepts. And that's another thing that we realize, that you can't measure it in the now and now. It may take a decade. We have six brigadier generals for our first course, which was 3 years ago, who are in the general staff. Our general staff is 20 major generals. 6 of them are graduates of our course. The chief of general staff is a graduate of our first SOD evolution, and still it's not enough. Maybe if the entire general staff goes through our course, and the only people who are sent to the course are people who are expected to, have the potential to be promoted, maybe then they would see it, and maybe we won't see it at all. Maybe there wouldn't be any impact, but we cannot know, and that can't dictate what we do and how we do it. The final thing that I put is, how do you come up with, again, that trap? Then when I said that design doesn't fit into doctrine, but not all generals are genius, so, or have this intuition to begin with. So how do you teach design without teaching? And how you teach design without manuals, okay? That's a trap that you have to find a way to avoid, and maybe you have to find a way to avoid it every time with a new team in a different way. Maybe some teams are more prone to theory, and some will never read a sentence that they didn't write themselves. And the last thing is the day after Shimon Afeh. Now, not that I expect him to go anywhere any soon. His health is better than all of us. We're still, all of us, are operating in the reality that he created for us, this systemic operational design. And if each of us doesn't have his or hers island, which is their own in SOD, it means that we're just followers, parrots, converts, but it will not go on until, that's it. Thank you. This will finish by the time we end the session.